Hello, and welcome to the Psych Leadership Podcast, the podcast where we used to discuss the intersection between psychology, leadership, and what it means to your small business. So, I am your host, Luke Upchurch. So happy that you took time to hang out with me again. I told you a while back that I was going to revitalize the podcast a little bit, and frankly, I've been a little hung up on other things. I've been dealing with some health issues, so I appreciate your patience hanging in there with me. But today I'm back and we are pivoting our program a little bit. So some of you may know that outside of Psych Leadership, I have a small nonprofit called Rise Up Academics. Well, Rise Up Academics is focused on the idea of building leadership and mentoring opportunities for high school students predominantly. We've started getting into college students as well and working with them, offering internship positions, scholarships, things along those lines. But our foundation was really at the high school level. And so I was doing psych leadership more focused on small business owners and building that gap. And I realized that I was leaving out a good chunk of my target audience. So today marks a pivot in a new direction. Today, we are actually starting down the journey of combining Rise Up Academics and Psych Leadership. So you may have noticed the new thumbnail or new icon shows that Psych Leadership is a division of Rise Up Academics. And so with that, we're going to pivot our message just a little bit. So I certainly don't want to leave out anybody. If you are a small business owner, I hope that this is still something valuable for you. But what we've learned here is that as we're working with high school students, as we're working with college students, we realize that there's quite a bit of juxtaposition there, changing from that concept of being in high school, migrating into college, and then what about when you get that degree? You get that magic piece of paper that says, "Yay, I am smart. I am ready to enter the job market." But are you really? Well, that's what the new direction of psych leadership is all about. So we are now a division of Rise Up Academics. That means that first off, you won't be able to book time with me directly any longer. You can still reach me via the I'll put a link. I'll put my new email address in there. But you'll basically still be able to reach me if you have questions or anything that I can help you out with. But it's really focused on those students that are transitioning from high school into college and college into career life. And so that's really what we're trying to get into. And that brings me to the point of our very first episode with this new direction. We're going to focus on finding your first footing, migrating into the migrating into real world. So starting your career can feel exciting, but it's also a little overwhelming. And that's what we'll be looking into here, is getting into how can I make this maybe a little less overwhelming for you. So with that, let's dive into some content. Um, and actually, you know what? Why don't I share a little bit of my news with you? Part of why I had to step away there a little bit, I finally finished my master's degree. And so although I'm making this podcast for our transitioning college, high school students, frankly, I'm living in this space myself. So I just finished the master's in child and adolescent psychology, but many of you know that my day job is actually in the IT field, completely by accident. Didn't necessarily wake up one day thinking that I would be in IT, much less cybersecurity. But that's where I find myself these days, and so I'm right there with you in terms of that transition. I'm right there in that same understanding of I just completed a degree that's all focused on psychology and adolescent development, things along those lines. And I really want to dive in and use that right away. That's not always the reality that we live in, though. And so transitioning into a career can really be difficult. What I'm going to challenge you to think through here, There's actually a psychological theory around this. It comes from a psychologist, Nancy Schlossberg. She talks about this concept of transition theory. Okay. So when we're moving from the high school space to the college space and from the college space into the career, these aren't just logistical changes, folks. These are emotional, psychological changes. And so Schlossberg's theory shapes us around four areas on how we cope. There's situation, self, support, and strategies. So, for example, a new grad entering the job market, they can feel stress not only from the workload, but also from the lack of support or weak coping strategies. And most of that stress is in the transition around the process. It's not about your ability. So let that sink in a little bit. It's we get all this education, but a lot of times the education is more in theory, not necessarily in practice. So that can create a lot of anxiety there as we shift from that student identity to that professional identity. So identity transitions, it's a struggle sometimes because we're leaving behind grades. We're moving into performance based on collaboration and influence and results, right? So your boss doesn't necessarily give you an A or an F as you finish a project, but they're looking at, well, did you achieve it on the deadline? Did you work well with others? Right? A lot of our evaluations in the corporate environment have shifted from obviously from the grades that you would get into school, but they've actually shifted into a what versus a how methodology. So what are you achieving, and then how did you do it? So it's not a matter of just achieving a goal with the right types of metrics, right? But it's also, did you do it in such a way that didn't come off like a complete jerk? Okay. So there's that identity transition that comes into play. But then there's also we kind of struggle sometimes in this identity shift with an in-between feeling, right? So you're not a student, but you tell yourself that you're not quite a professional yet. This leads us down the road of imposter syndrome. Okay. So imposter syndrome is where you feel like maybe you haven't earned it. You don't have the education, you don't have the experience. And understand, when I say you don't have the education, again, that education a lot of times was in theory. So hopefully you were able to do some sort of internship. Hopefully you were able to get some aspect of that collegiate career where you were in that real world experience, right? Something that you can tie back to. But that's not always the case. So that can be a struggle for folks being in that, like I said, that identity transition, that in between feeling. And self doubt, right, in this space is absolutely common. So I'm going to challenge you here to be aware of what you know and be comfortable with what you don't. Nobody expects you to come straight out of a high school situation or a college situation with immediate experience in the world. When I work with somebody in that space, and in fact, I was having this conversation with my interns just earlier today. With Rise Up Academics, we have high school level and collegiate level interns, and we partner them with clients out there in the community. And so I had this one student today that he is working with one of our clients in Viso AI out of California. And this young man, he has studied Python. He actually reached out to me over the summer, was concerned with what he knew and what he assumed he would need, right? And that variance. And he said, am I going to get into this internship position and not be able to hold my own? Am I going to be overshadowed by what other folks know or not meet the expectations of the client in this case? And I had to reassure him and let him know, first off, the client isn't always aware of how to do whatever it is we've hired you to do, right? If they could do your job, they wouldn't need you. So there's that variance there. But then there's also this idea of helping them gain that confidence, helping them get over that self-doubt and realize that even though you may not have the experience, that doesn't mean that you can't step back and answer the questions. So we walked through a really simple analogy. Now, mind you, none of these students have a contracting background or anything like that, but I was explaining the idea of sometimes your client isn't fully aware of what they don't know. And so I said, imagine for me that I am a prospective home buyer and that you work in construction. You are going to be my home builder. And I tell you that on my home that I want you to build for me, I want a big deck and I want a 9,000 pound hot tub, great big hot tub to sit on this deck. But I really want to use the patio underneath the deck too. So I only want 2 posts to hold up this deck. And I asked the students, recognizing that you don't have any skills in construction, you've never built a house, you've probably never built a deck. What is wrong with this equation? And so, of course, the kids look at me for a minute, and one kid raises his hand and he says, well, the 2 posts is just not going to be enough. That's too much weight. There's no way that a deck can hold that. And I said, well, how do you know? And he said, well, it's common sense. I don't have to know about building code. I don't have to know all those other details, but I do know that 2 posts would probably not be enough unless they're really big posts. And I said, okay, so if this was your client, how do you approach that? And he said, well, I guess I would clarify how big can these posts be, because maybe it would work. Again, I don't know building code, but maybe it would work. He goes, or maybe we could go smaller on the hot tub. 9,000 pound hot tub sounds more like a swimming pool. And maybe to that end, do you really want the hot tub or pool or whatever that structure is? Do you really want it on top of the deck? If your deck is big enough to hold that, would it also be big enough to shade that, right? Could you put it under the deck on the patio? And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is just a clean example of exactly what I'm talking about. Here, this student had no idea about construction, had never built a deck, doesn't know anything about those concepts, but he had enough common sense and enough tenacity to be able to challenge this idea, to say, you know what, the thing you want might not work the way that you want it to, but let me seek some clarity. Let me ask you some questions, and maybe we can pivot into something else. Okay. So I'm going to challenge you then to rein in that self doubt, rein in that imposter syndrome, and know that yes, you went to school, you got that education. Do you have the experience? Maybe not. But education, when you get a degree, that's not about teaching you everything, right? A person that gets their college degree, whether it's psychology or basket weaving, it's not that they know every single aspect about that. College teaches you how to research. College teaches you how to ask the right questions. So when you feel that self-doubt rising up, understand that you're the expert. They hired you because they couldn't do the job themselves. They hired you because you had something that another applicant didn't have. And so it's okay to have a little bit of self-doubt. It's not okay to hide behind it. So how do we cope? How do we cope then with that transition? Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of a toolkit here. I teased this at the beginning, right? We talked about Nancy Schlossberg, and I know that I'm butchering that name, so just pretend. I'll put it in the notes. Nancy Schlossberg is, as I believe, the correct pronunciation. But she talks about having 5 key components to help you with that transition. First one is situation. So break big changes into smaller pieces. So what I'm going to ask you to do here, you're transitioning from college into the real world, into the work environment. First thing I would want to do is understand things like, well, how am I going to show up? And I mean this at the most fundamental level. Am I logging in remotely? Am I physically going in? Right? And so then I can break that into smaller changes. Well, one small change, for example, I'll use my example for completing my master's degree. Let's say that I was going in and actually working at a psychologist office. Well, I completed my degree completely online. So maybe that is one change. Maybe I need to adjust my wardrobe. Maybe I need to, um, maybe I need to get a better computer, right? Maybe the business gives that to me, but maybe not. So maybe I need to work on those kind of things. So that's our situation. Break changes into smaller chunks. It's easier to handle that way. I'm going to take you back to the episode of Friends where Chandler was worried about going to the altar, and Ross tells him, well, the first thing you need to do is just put on your tux, right? The wedding piece is scary, but putting on your tux, not so scary. So same thing here, right? Changing to an in-office environment when I've been working at home for 11 years would be a big shift for me. But the first thing I would want to do is make sure that I'm showing up in maybe better attire than what I'd wear when I was working at home. Okay. Ripped jeans are fine when I'm at home, but maybe when I'm in the office, not so much. The next piece is going to be self. You need to build some self efficacy, reflect on past resilience and wins. So, yeah, it's scary putting yourself out there. It's intimidating. It builds anxiety in us to put yourself out there. But you didn't get this far on the coattails of somebody else. You didn't get this far because you didn't have the capability. So, work on self efficacy. Think about how you've been resilient in the past. Think about the wins that you've had. Next, Miss Schlossberg there leans us into the idea of support. So we've talked a lot on this channel, and I know this is a new direction for us, but I'm going to ask my new patron, or not patrons, my new listeners to go back and listen to some of those old episodes. I talk a lot about mentoring and that support system. So I'm a big advocate for mentors. You should have multiple mentors targeted to specific things that you're trying to build. So support, lean on your mentors. What about your peers? If you're graduating, surely you got to know a couple folks in your class, right? Some of your colleagues, some of your friends are graduating too. You might also lean into things like family, all to lighten the weight. Okay. So even when I started thinking through what am I going to do with psych leadership, when I was focused on small business, frankly, I wasn't getting any consulting gigs. I was getting a lot of listeners, but I wasn't getting anything that paid me to continue doing this. And I thought, you know what? Maybe I'm spreading myself too thin. I talked to my mentor. This is right. I bounced this off a couple of my mentors. I contacted colleagues in the field. I reached out to my wife, to my kids, my family, and just talked through these things because frankly, I wasn't sure that I wanted to move in this direction. And they really helped me think through what is valuable to me and where am I providing value. And so that leads us to our strategies. So we already talked about that support system as a coping skill, but what other strategies might you lean into? Well, we've talked again on this channel, past episodes, we've talked about the idea of journaling. We've also talked about the concept of reframing. So when you feel that self-doubt coming in and you think, gosh, I don't belong here. What did I do? I made such a mistake at this degree, at this job, at this moment. Challenge that and say, but I'm here to learn. Did I come in knowing everything? Well, no. Frankly, if you already knew everything about the job, why'd you take it? Right? You're in the wrong space. But if you reframe that to say, I don't have to know everything, but I'm here to learn. I'm here to gain an experience. Okay? So these aren't abstract ideas, folks. These are concrete steps that you can practice every day. Think through situations, self-support, and strategies. All right. So we're almost done. I'm going to leave you with a couple closing comments. First off, transitions are temporary. The discomfort fades, but the growth remains. So you're not always going to feel like you don't belong. It does take time. And I don't know about you, but the biggest way that I feel more at home is when I gain knowledge. I told you at the top of the call, I wound up in IT and cybersecurity, no less, completely by accident. I didn't go to college for it. I didn't, sit in my bed as a 5-year-old dreaming of someday working in cybersecurity. It was a happy accident. I just one day got to working with the team and they said, "Hey, you should come hang with us." And that's pretty much how it played out, right? There was a long time there that I felt really uncomfortable about it. It wasn't my education, it wasn't my background. All the IT stuff I had done was more or less out of necessity, right? So, no different than the guy that learns how to fix his car because he can't afford somebody else to do it. So, he figures it out himself. That's not to say he does it right. It's just to say the car's still running. Well, that was my relationship with IT, right? I just kind of figured it out, not necessarily the right way. And so when I joined this team, I felt like each and every one of you. I felt like I was in over my head. Why am I here? I didn't study for this. I didn't necessarily want this. I just kind of accidentally fell into it. So I went out and I started getting training. I was actually just the other day having a conversation with one of my colleagues. We were talking about a concept in cybersecurity called hashing. And because I had gone out and taken some training and watched some videos and got educated myself, I was actually able to follow the conversation. And I know that sounds like such a small thing, but it was a victory for me. Okay. So again, discomfort fades, the growth remains. You want to normalize the uncertainty, normalize the concept of uncertainty as a sign of becoming part of that team. Okay. Your call to action today is to reflect on the 4 S's, right? What is your situation? How are you focusing on self efficacy? What is your support system? And what is your coping strategy? The next episode, we're going to identify purpose and how we navigate crossroads. I'll be back with you in a couple weeks. My goal here is to have these every 2 weeks going forward. So I hope you have a wonderful day. And again, we will talk soon. Thanks. Bye-bye. Hey, you made it all the way to the end of the podcast. Thanks so much for your time today. If you like this content, I'm going to ask that you consider a small donation. Every little bit helps, but this allows us to continue not only doing the podcast, but actually offering the internship positions, the leadership conferences, as well as the in-person courses that we deliver to high school and college students. Think about hitting the donation button for me. And again, we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.